Hi everybody, I'm back again and I do apologise for having been away for so long, but I've been busy with other projects. But I'm back and I'd like to talk to you today about clones. Now, it's a subject that's come up quite a lot and it basically breaks down into two camps. There's those who think that clones don't exist, and there's those who are convinced that clones do exist and that many politicians and many film stars have all got clones waiting in the wings to take over from them, and so on. So, I spoke to the Great White Brotherhood about it, and they've actually given me quite a long dissertation about it, and it's broken down actually into 3 parts, we could say 4 parts. They're going to talk about whether it's possible to clone humans. They're going to mention animals that are cloned. Then they're going to talk about the concept that people are able to make human bodies with artificial intelligent minds. And then as a last thing, they suddenly talked about what's called the 20 and back syndrome. You may have heard of it. People claim to have gone off to Mars or the moon or somewhere, and they spend 20 years on a base there, and then they're regressed and brought back and reinserted in their family 20 years earlier, and as if nothing had happened, okay? Now, I may well have to I'm going to read what I've got, but I may well have to sort of keep stopping and explaining things that might be a little bit difficult to understand. Okay? Right, now, they just gave me a little introduction that doesn't concern you, but they start with this, really. We wish you to understand that every instant of every moment of the life of any living object is recorded and is available for inspection in the akashic record, also called the living library. And I'm sure you can understand that. It means that every thought that you have, every action you take, everything you do is recorded from the moment of your birth until the moment of your demise in this akashic record. And if people can train themselves to go into that area, they can examine either their own life or the life of any other person, okay? Thus, in the case of clones, we can observe the original person who is to be cloned. We can observe the doctors, geneticists, and scientists performing their experiments. We remind you that in the Akashic record, it is possible to see years of time in a flash, and thus we have been able to follow the progress of this scientific group as they have struggled to perfect the cloning technique. We will state that so far their experiments have not been crowned with success, and that's their rather posh way for saying that the scientists have failed to make clones. Genetics is a very complicated process involving actions occurring in the astral planes as well as physicality. As these genetic scientists ignore totally the many changes that would need to occur in numerous levels of the astral dimensions, even cloning the simplest entity, producing an exact duplicate of the original, is met with failure. Now, this assumes that you've read the book that we've got for free on our site about genetics, and if you've read that book, you will have noticed that genetics doesn't only occupy itself with physical DNA, it occupies itself with astral DNA as well. And a human, well, most animals as well, but particularly humans, are a very complicated mixture of physical and astral DNA. And that's what they're talking about here. Producing a fully fledged working duplicate of a human, the most intricate of all of God's creation, is totally beyond anything that humans at this state of their evolution could achieve. The physical body is a representation of the astral bodies, a reflection, reduced in frequency, of the astral features of a person, by which they imply that before you incarnate here, you've got a kind of a blueprint of who you are. He'll explain a little bit more, but talking about the physical aspects and your spiritual aspects, your mental aspects, your who you really are in total. Okay, it all plays a role. The physical body. Oh, I've already read that bit. The physical situation is further complicated by putting into the equation the genes of the parents. So, before one starts, there is a mixture of 3 types of genes in the body: the genes of the mother, the father, and the genes of the person in astral form, which eventually will work down and become part of that person, not only in physical form, but also how he thinks and talks and all the rest of it. We break off here to remind you that the demonic forces from the lower 4th dimension tried for hundreds of years to produce working versions of humans, and their experiments always ended in failure. You know, you've heard people talk about the Greys producing human beings, making human beings in test tubes and things in their spaceships. In fact, they don't. That's just another myth. These Greys were not trying to produce clones. They were just trying to produce humans. To produce an exact duplicate of a person is infinitely more complicated than just manufacturing any human. We will say that which we have already stated elsewhere. It is not in the purview of man to produce any living object. That task is in the hands of God's archangels, and it is they that decide to put a life force in association with an object or not. It is the life force that gives meaning to something. Without that, a created flesh body is just a meat form and will not move. It is the life spirit that animates an entity. Without that, there can be no life in anything. It would just be an empty shell without any vestige of life. God's archangels have always refused to condone the fabrication of God's creatures and have always refused to help fabricate monsters. Now, we're going to go on in a few minutes to talk about cloning of animals, which is not quite the same thing. Many civilizations over many long years have tried to duplicate life and have always been frustrated. And they're talking about civilizations that came long before we were here. We're just the latest one of many, many different civilizations that have come and gone. And none of them could produce clones because none of them have been given that life spirit without which nothing can exist. God's angels will not hand out the secret of life ever. It is the golden pot at the end of the rainbow. You know, the crock of gold that the leprechauns talk about. The chalice sought by religion, the ultimate secret, and is destined to remain so for all eternity. Now, they're going to go on to talk about cloning of animals now for a few minutes, and then they'll go back to talking about humans again. Now, animals. We remind you that scientists thinking that they are cloning animals, sheep, dogs, etc., are fooling themselves. They take a DNA sample from a female creature and duplicate it. But they must realize that even one particle of animal substance contains both the DNA of both parents and eventually the DNA of the creature as it grows, both in physicality and even more so through the astral features clinging to that sample. And that comes from junk DNA. Now, I know that sounds very complicated, but if you read the book about genes, you will start to understand, I hope, that there's much more to all life, not just the physical DNA, but the astral DNA as well, which is actually more important than the physical DNA. The physical DNA is just the end result of what's going on in the astral realms. Thus, the animal grown is in fact done in a distorted fashion, the way nature works, and although the creature might resemble the mother, it is not a duplicate of the mother. Thus, the archangels put a life force with it for a while before withdrawing that life force. The archangels try to assist all life, and they assist geneticists as they toy with the building blocks of life and give life for a while to the results of their experiments before withdrawing that life force to remind humanity that the construction and destruction of life is in God's hands, not man's. That presumably is why when they say they've cloned a dog or a cat or whatever, a sheep, it doesn't tend to live as long as the parents might have done, because the archangels take the life force away eventually. Now, it's going back to talk about humans and why they won't put the life force with a cloned body, a created body. The principal aim of these scientists that are doing the genetic experiments is to create armies of slaves that can be used, abused, and rejected when of no further use. This is an evil concept, which is why God's archangels refuse to put the life force in association with those objects. Anyone who has read and understood the book on genes we gave you will realize that life, particularly human life, is extremely complicated, and no geneticist could have the faintest concept of duplicating a human, the pinnacle of God's creation. We turn now to those pretending to have seen clones of people. And this is kind of interesting because I recently have heard people say that, yes, clones exist, and as I said, film stars and politicians have all got clones, and there's even somewhere an underground city in America somewhere full of clones. The only snag being that when people talk to people who claim to know about clones and they say, have you actually ever seen one? And people sort of, no, so-and-so told me that they exist, but I haven't actually seen one. And this is because they don't actually exist. Everybody, well, a lot of people believe they exist, but nobody's actually seen one. And we're going on now. We do not criticize any individual, no matter what he says or does, but we remind you that in the akashic record, the living library, every aspect of every event is recorded. We have studied at length these records and can state quite categorically that the stories of viable human clones being produced is not supported by the evidence contained in the akashic record. If it were true that clones of humans are successfully being produced, we would say so. But the akashic record contains endless files of man's failures. It also contains the files of those producing these claims. We leave you to draw your own conclusions as to the motives of those stating that clones exist. All right, and then they just draw it to an end and stop, okay? So now I'm going to go on and talk about clones and artificial intelligence, because someone said that what scientists can do is create a flesh body, a physical body, put an artificial intelligent brain in it, and it can walk about and talk just like a politician or a film star. So this is what they're going to talk about. Although it is possible genetically to create a body that would look human, to create a body that is the exact duplicate of a living person is, at the stage that geneticists are at the moment, impossible. A person looks like he does, as we have said, due to the mixture of his parents' genes and his own genes. Even in the case of identical twins, although superficially they may look identical, as one gets to know them, one can notice slight differences due to the person's genes altering slightly the appearance. Some of these differences may be covered with clothes, but if the twins were examined naked, slight differences would be noticed, and certainly each twin would have his own distinct personality. I'm just going to have a drink of water, if I may, please. Oh, thank you. Now, we repeat, God's archangels refuse to put the Logos of God in association with any created human, and it is that Logos that gives the appearance of life to a human. Equally, a human is such a complicated form of creation that it is quite impossible to give the appearance of life artificially. Even if the most advanced computer was somehow hooked up to a created human body, apart from some parts of it jerking about, Frankenstein's monster style, the body could not stand, walk, and talk. There would need to be hundreds of computers linked to virtually every part of the brain in order just to make it move. And so one would have a person with thousands of cables connected to thousands of parts of the brain, each computer sending signals to these diverse parts of the brain just to get the person to stand and move. It is not practical and has never been achieved. Then, to make the being think and talk, the scientists would need to create astral computers connected to the mind, and yet more computers transferring information from the mind to the brain in order for it to be able to express thoughts and words. Astral computers do not exist. Therefore, we hope that you can see that any human body grown in a laboratory will never be able to move or to ape a real person. A real living person has a mass of non-physical aspects that make it function. Its life plan, its higher self, imagination, the imagination plane, the mind, and of course, the life spirit. It's not just flesh and a brain. We're much more than that. It also has a mass of DNA working to coordinate the physical and non-physical aspects. So we repeat, It is not possible to create a working human being, and it is not possible to create a human working with artificial intelligence. None of this will ever be created by man. Life is a gift from God, and it is in the hands of the archangels to create all this. Anyone claiming that living, thinking, artificial humans exist is mistaken. Now, I'm sorry it's dragging on a bit, but I'm going to, as a last thing, talk about this 20 and back program. As I mentioned, people assume, or some people say, that they've been involved in experiments where they've been taken off to the moon or to Mars or some other planet somewhere, spent 20 years in a base there, and then they have their mind wiped, their body returned to what it was 20 years previously, and they're reinserted into their family as if nothing had happened. Okay? So can they talk about that? It is, in theory, possible to program a mind so that the person forgets a period of time. This can be done using drugs and trauma. It happens sometimes naturally if a person has an experience so horrific that his mind refuses to accept what happened, and so the person has no memory of that event. However, there is a limit to how much a mind can be so affected that the memory is refuted by the mind. We will say that the memory is retained in the higher self and also in that person's file in the akashic record, which is why the memory can eventually return on its own or be recovered through hypnosis. However, creating a trauma, either through drugs or torture, to erase 20 years of a person's life experience seems far-fetched to us. We are not saying that a single event lasting a short period of time cannot be forgotten, and we are not saying that a longer period of time cannot be forgotten, but we are saying that we can find no evidence in the akashic record that people have had 20 years of experience removed. It seems to us to be one of the latest tales invented by people wishing to create fame from fictional tales, and such stories should be taken with a pinch of salt. There are myths being created at the moment concerning bases on the moon and on Mars that are entirely fictional. People are only too willing to believe these wild stories, and the more unlikely the tale, the more people seem willing to accept them. We have stated that both the moon and Mars are under the control of reptilians, and it is not in their nature to allow anyone to share what they consider their own. Therefore, we can state that these tales of military and scientific bases on the moon and on Mars are entirely fictional. After all, who can check whether such tales are true or not? A person states that he spent a certain amount of time on a planet, describes his experiences, and one either believes that person or one doesn't. We do not wish to put an untimely end to any career a person is attempting to create for himself, but we are concerned that the public are beginning to believe these tales. Authors such as Jules Verne, that created books exploring undersea worlds, going to the centre of the earth, or exploring space, were writing fiction, and much of it is very entertaining. However, these authors never pretended to be presenting truth. They wrote books of fiction. But people nowadays have taken these genres a step further and pretend that it happened to them. This is dishonest. Obviously, there are scientists attempting to explore space and are sometimes helped by greys or tall whites who have spacecraft. But these scientists have not set up bases on any planet, moon, or astral body. Space exploration technology is still in its infancy, and man is a long way from having the technology of travelling vast distances and transporting tons of equipment to a body to set up a base. A moment's thought should be enough to realise that to transport tons of equipment far out into space would be impossibly complicated at the moment. But, as we said, the wilder the story, the more people seem willing to believe. However, we leave those creating these stories and those believing them to their own conscience. We are reluctant to criticise people, but there comes a time when we feel obliged to warn people that they are overstepping a line in the sand. Creating fiction is entertaining, but creating false realities is dishonest and misleading. Is dishonest and misleading gullible people is lying, which is a sin in God's eyes. One should never lie. Their lies will, of course, be found out in time, but the disappointment created when a trusted person is found to have created a tissue of lies is very harmful. So, we repeat, we do not accept that this idea of going off somewhere for 20 years, having the mind wiped, and the person being reinserted back into society at the point he left is based, in fact, at all. One person tried the story and it worked for a while. So others are jumping on the bandwagon to create similar stories. Our advice is to use your common sense and analyse what the person says. A liar needs a good memory, and eventually all liars slip up. That should be your yardstick. Check as far as you can what the person states, and above all, use your common sense. Now, to finish off about time travel, it's only a short bit. Concerning time travel, we have already stated that time travel in a physical sense is not possible, although it is in an astral sense by linking to the minds of those in the past and, to a certain extent, in the future. But time manipulation, as stated by some people, is not possible. It is not possible to move someone back 20 years physically. By altering timelines, moving someone to a different timeline, it is possible to alter apparent time by moving that person to a timeline slightly out of phase with our reality. But we are talking seconds, not years. Once again, all this is part of the yarn created by those seeking fame or fortune and should be rejected. And that's what I got to say about that. I don't know if you understood it, but basically they're saying that clones don't exist and will never exist. And anybody saying they are is in some way or other mistaken. Okay, so I'll leave it at that, and I'll come back and talk to you, I hope in the not too distant future, on another topic. Okay, bye. Thank you for listening.